The late summer sun hung low over the Red Willow Basin, bathing the rolling hills in a haze of spun gold. The air itself was thick and warm, a tangible presence that carried the dry, herbal scent of sagebrush and the resinous perfume of distant pine forests. Dust, fine as pollen, coated everything: the thirsty leaves of the cottonwoods, the split-rail fences that snaked across the landscape, and the weary woman who stood at the gate of the Coyote's Mercy Ranch. A soft wind, more a sigh than a breeze, stirred the dust, making the world shimmer as if seen through old, warped glass. It was a land of stark beauty and quiet endurance, a place that demanded everything from those who chose to call it home. Maribel Quinn, at 28, felt older than her years. The lines of her face were drawn not by age, but by a quiet, persistent sorrow that had settled deep within her bones. She was a woman adrift, a schoolteacher without a schoolhouse, moving from one dusty township to another, her few belongings packed into a single worn trunk in the back of a rented buckboard. She carried with her the usual tools of her trade slates: chalk, a few precious books with cracked spines, but her heaviest burden was invisible. It was a hollow ache, a profound emptiness that the doctors in St. Louis had given a clinical name but could offer no cure for. An empty womb, a silent testament to a life she could never create. That wound, raw and hidden, had driven her west, seeking a landscape vast enough to contain her grief. The sign above the gate was crudely carved, the letters burned into a weathered plank of wood. Coyote's Mercy. The name struck her as a contradiction, a paradox of the frontier. Coyotes were survivors, opportunists, their howls a lonely and often cruel sound in the dead of night. Mercy was a softer thing, a grace she had not often encountered. Perhaps, she thought, this was a place where survival and kindness had learned to coexist. Taking a steadying breath that did little to calm the tremor in her hands, she pushed the heavy gate open. It groaned on its leather hinges, the sound loud in the vast stillness, as if summoned by the noise. A man emerged from the deep shadows of a large barn. He did not hurry. His movements were measured, deliberate, the way a man moves when he has only his own rhythms to answer to. This was Jesse Calder. The sun had baked the fabric of his work shirt to a faded, dusty blue and had tanned his skin to the color of rich earth. His shoulders were broad, shaped by labor, not by vanity. But it was his eyes that held Maribel's attention. They were the color of a twilight sky, deep and quiet, and in them, she saw the twin reflections of a man who had known great loss and had somehow made his peace with it. He was a fortress of solitude, but the gates were not locked, merely closed. He stopped a few paces from her, his gaze taking in her dusty traveling dress, the exhaustion etched onto her features, and the determined set of her jaw. He said nothing, simply waited. Silence was a language in this part of the country, and he was fluent in it. Maribel cleared her throat, the sound small against the backdrop of the wind. "Mr. Calder," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Maribel Quinn. I was told in the town of Buckhorn Gap that there were children out this way with no schooling." Jesse's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something interest, perhaps, or caution moved in the depths of his eyes. He gave a slow, single nod, an invitation for her to continue. This was the moment she had rehearsed 100 times on the long, jolting journey. She had tried to find the right words that would sound professional, competent, and detached. But as she stood before this quiet, stoic man, the carefully constructed phrases fell away, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth. "I am a teacher," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I am also a woman who cannot bear children." The confession slipped out, unbidden but necessary. It was the core of her story, the source of her pain and her purpose. "But," she added, her chin lifting, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed, "I know how to nurture a heart. I know how to make letters into friends and numbers into tools, I can give them a world bigger than this valley." The silence that followed was profound. A hawk circled high overhead, a lonely speck in an endless blue sky. Jesse Calder did not look away. He seemed to be looking past her words, past the dust and the weariness, into the very heart of her. He was weighing her, not as an employee, but as a person. He was measuring the trust in her every breath, the honesty in her stark admission. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, he gave that same slow, deliberate nod as before. It was not just an agreement. It was an acceptance, as if his gesture were a signal. A flash of movement caught Maribel's eye. Peeking from behind the corner of a weathered corral fence were two small figures. A boy, perhaps 9 years old, with a thatch of unruly brown hair and a fiercely protective stance. He had one arm partially extended, holding back a much smaller girl of about 6, whose wide, curious eyes were fixed on the strange woman at the gate. They were like a pair of wild fawns, poised to bolt at the slightest threat. These were the hearts that needed nurturing, Tommy Pike and Birdie. Jesse turned and led her toward the main ranch house, a long, low structure built of sturdy logs and river stones. The porch was swept clean, and a bench beside the door held a mending basket, a needle still threaded through a small, torn shirt. Inside, the main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace. A fire was smoldering, its embers casting a warm, orange glow that danced across the room. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and baking bread. It was a simple, lived-in space, filled with the quiet evidence of a life pieced together. An old, faded shawl with a delicate floral pattern was hung on a wooden peg by the hearth, a ghostly feminine presence in this masculine domain. It spoke of a past, of a family that was no longer whole but was being held together by determination and a stubborn sort of kindness. Maribel found herself watching Jesse as he moved about the room, stoking the fire, and then gesturing for her to sit at the heavy wooden table. His hands, though calloused and scarred from ranch work, were surprisingly graceful. He brought her a cup of water, his movements economical and sure. Later, as the afternoon light began to fade, she watched him from the porch as he tended to his horse. He bent to check and re-cinched the saddle, his touch on the animal firm but gentle. He spoke to the horse in a low, soothing murmur, a stream of quiet words he did not seem to possess for people. Each movement was precise, chaste, and imbued with a deep, unspoken tenderness. It was the way a man acted when he believed no one was watching, a glimpse into the true nature of his character. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose, Jesse finally broke his long silence. He was leaning against the porch railing, looking out at the vast, darkening prairie. Not at her. His voice was low, rough around the edges like worn leather. "You said it was all right," he began, the words seeming to cost him some effort. "Not to have children of your own." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "There are enough hearts here that need a home, more than enough." It was not a preamble to a job offer. It was an acknowledgement. He had heard her, the spoken words and the unspoken pain behind them. He understood. In that moment, Maribel felt a profound sense of relief wash over her, so potent it almost brought her to tears. She had offered him her deepest vulnerability, and he had met it not with pity, but with a quiet, profound acceptance. It was a key turning in a lock she hadn't even realized was there. That evening, she was shown to a small room at the back of the house, just off the kitchen. It was Spartan, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden crate for a nightstand, and a single window that looked out onto the moon-drenched pasture. It was more than enough. A clothesline had been strung near the warmth of the kitchen stove, and on it hung a few small garments. One was a little girl's dress, its hem patched with a piece of mismatched fabric. The stitches were large and clumsy, the work of a man's hands, a man trying his best to hold a small world together. Maribel reached out and touched the rough seam. She thought of the little girl with the wide, curious eyes, and the quiet man with the weight of the world on his sun-darkened shoulders. She thought of the name of the ranch, Coyote's Mercy, survival and kindness. Here, in this lonely basin, under a blanket of stars. She felt the raw, aching wound inside her begin to quiet. It was still there, a part of her always, but it no longer felt like an ending. Here, it might just be a beginning. She had wandered far and wide, lost and searching, and had somehow, impossibly, stumbled into the one place she was most needed. She had come to the right place. The first morning broke clear and sharp, the sun climbing with purpose over the eastern ridge. Long before the heat settled, Maribel was awake. She had never been a good sleeper, and the unfamiliar quiet of the ranch, a quiet punctuated by the distant, mournful cry of a coyote and the soft shifting of the house as it settled, had kept her suspended between waking and sleep. She rose and moved to the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the smooth, worn floorboards. The heart of the stove was still warm. She added a few sticks of kindling and a split log, coaxing the flames back to life. She found a tin of dried mint leaves on a high shelf and steeped a pot, the sharp, clean scent filling the room and cutting through the lingering smell of wood smoke and old coffee. She carried her tin mug out to the porch. Jesse was already gone, likely hours ago, a lone figure moving against the vastness of his land. The children were still asleep. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket over the valley. It was in this stillness that she made her plan. When the children finally emerged, rubbing sleep from their eyes, she was ready. She hadn't brought them into the dim, close air of the kitchen. Instead, she had taken a wide, cracked slate board and an assortment of chalk nubs and set them beneath the shade of a magnificent, trembling aspen tree near the creek bed. The leaves, already hinting at the yellow of autumn, rustled and danced in the morning breeze, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light. Tommy Pike strode out with the defensive swagger of a 9-year-old boy trying to prove he was a man. His shirt was buttoned all wrong, the placket skewed and uneven, a small, stark reminder that he was still a child dressing himself in the dark. He eyed the slate board with suspicion. "Ain't got time for marks," he muttered, kicking at a loose stone. Birdie, small and ethereal, followed in his wake, clutching a faceless corn-husk doll. She stood just behind him, using his small frame as a shield, her eyes enormous and fixed on Maribel. They were the eyes of a creature who had learned that the world was unpredictable, a place where a loud voice or a wrong move could bring unwanted attention. She was terrified of getting it wrong. "This isn't just marks, Tommy," Maribel said, her voice calm and even. She took a sip of her now cool mint tea. "This is a map." "Map to where?" he challenged. "Everywhere," she said simply. She took a piece of white chalk and drew a large, slightly lopsided circle on the board. "What's this?" Birdie whispered something into Tommy's back. "A circle," Tommy said, grudgingly. "It is," Maribel agreed. "But look." She added a wide, curved line above it and another below. "Now what is it?" Birdie took a half-step forward, her curiosity momentarily overcoming her fear. It's Mr. Calder's hat," she breathed. "Exactly," Maribel smiled. "And the letter O is the brim of his hat. It's the sound you make when you're surprised." "Oh." Tommy's skepticism wavered. He watched as she wiped the slate clean with a damp rag. She drew a long, sinuous, curving line. "What's this?" "A snake," Tommy said. His interest peaked. "A rattler." "That's right. And this is the letter S. It makes the sound a snake makes." She drew the letter again, exaggerating the curves. "The S is for sun and sage and snake." Tommy, forgetting his manly posture, edged closer. He picked up a piece of blue chalk. He slowly, carefully, drew his own S. It was shaky and backward. He scowled, his frustration immediate. and made to wipe it away with his sleeve. "No, wait." Maribel stopped him gently. "That's a fine snake. He's just looking the other way." Birdie let out a small, high-pitched giggle that sounded like a rusty hinge. Tommy looked at his backward S, then at Maribel, and a reluctant grin cracked the tough facade. The sound of their laughter, thin and bright under the rustling aspen, was the first true thaw. The ice was broken. They worked for an hour, drawing wagon wheels for O and branding irons for T, and the peaks of the distant mountains for M. As the sun climbed higher, Maribel saw Jesse returning from the ridgeline. He rode his horse not with force, but with a quiet, centered balance, as if he and the animal were of one mind. He didn't ride directly to them, respecting the space she had created. He passed by at a distance, disappearing into the barn. When Maribel took the children inside for a midday meal of bread and molasses, she found 2 items placed precisely in the center of the kitchen table, where she couldn't miss them. One was a heavy glass jar filled with dark, amber honey, buzzing with captured sunlight. The other was a tattered copy of the Farmer's Almanac. She picked up the almanac. It was not a gift of sentiment. It was a tool of survival. It held the phases of the moon, the predictions for frost, the planting charts. He was giving her the ranch's timetable. The honey was for the children. The almanac was for her. It was his way of saying, "I see what you are doing. Continue." It was a thank you more eloquent than any cluster of words. The day settled into a rhythm, marked not by the clock, but by the sun and the needs of the ranch. Maribel learned the cadence of the place, the metallic clang and rhythmic squeak of the water pump at dawn, the distant, musical chime of the bell on the lead cow, the rumble of the buckboard as Jesse headed to the trading post, the peculiar silence of high noon, when the heat pressed down and all the world seemed to hold its breath, and her favorite, the shift in the late afternoon, when the wind would rise from the west, carrying the clean, electric smell of ozone and the promise of rain that rarely came. She was discovering the children, too. They were not blank slates. They were volumes filled with hidden stories. Birdie, she learned, was a sleepwalker. Maribel woke one night to a floorboard creaking in the main room. She found the little girl standing by the cold hearth, her eyes open but unseeing, her hands reaching for the faded shawl that still hung on its peg. Maribel's heart constricted. She didn't wake her. She spoke in a low, soft murmur. "It's all right, sweetling. You're safe." She gently scooped the girl into her arms. Birdie was light as a handful of dry leaves, but her small body was rigid with some unspoken, nocturnal fear. Carrying her back to the small cot they shared, Maribel sat on the edge, rocking her. She hummed a tune without thinking, an old, simple melody from her own childhood in New England. It was a song about a river winding to the sea, a song of comfort and continuity. Birdie's breathing deepened, the tension leaving her small frame, and her hand, which had been clutching the air, found and gripped the fabric of Maribel's nightgown. Maribel sat there for a long time, holding the sleeping child, feeling the profound, aching weight of a life she was now responsible for. Tommy was a different challenge. His wounds were not carried in sleep. They were worn as armor in the daylight. He was quick-witted and fiercely proud, but a deep-seated stubbornness would rise in him, sudden and volatile. It was the anger of a boy who had learned that everyone eventually leaves. During a lesson on a particularly hot afternoon, he grew frustrated. The letters wouldn't form. The chalk kept breaking. "It's stupid," he suddenly declared, throwing the chalk stub to the ground, where it shattered into white dust. "I don't need marks. I need to know how to rope a steer. Jesse ropes. He don't write stupid letters." "Jesse also reads the almanac," Maribel said calmly, not rising to the bait. "He reads the brands on cattle and the labels on seed bags. Words are just as much a tool as a rope." Tommy, "It's woman's work," he spat, his face red. It was the ultimate 9-year-old insult. Maribel looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She saw the fear beneath the bravado, the fear of failing, the fear of not being strong enough, the fear of being unwanted. She did not judge him. She did not raise her voice. She went into the house and returned not with chalk, but with one of her precious pencils and a clean sheet of paper from her own dwindling supply. She knelt in the dust in front of him, meeting his defiant gaze. "This is harder than roping," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She held out the pencil. "It takes more strength." He looked at the pencil as if it were a snake. "I want you to write one word for me," she said. She put the pencil into his hand and closed his dusty fingers around it. "Write home." Tommy's face crumpled. The anger vanished, replaced by a raw, painful confusion. He knew the sounds. He knew the letters from her lessons. H-O-M-E. But the word itself was a question mark. Was this home? Or was it just another place to be before he was sent somewhere else? He stared at the blank paper, his jaw tight, fighting a battle she could only guess at. He didn't write the word. Not that day, but he kept the pencil. That evening, as the light turned to lavender and the air cooled, Maribel sat on the porch, mending one of Tommy's shirts. She saw Jesse by the firelight in the main room. He was hunched over something in his lap, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched, curious. He was holding Bertie's cornhusk doll and a needle and thread. He was trying to sew a dress for it out of a scrap of blue calico. His large, work-roughened hands, so competent and sure with a rope or an axe, were hopelessly clumsy with the tiny needle. He cursed under his breath as he pricked his finger, the thread tangling into a hopeless knot. He pulled it, making the knot worse. Maribel smiled to herself and was about to offer help when she saw the look on his face. It was a look of fierce, stubborn patience, a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. He would do this. He painstakingly unpicked the knot, rethreaded the needle, and started again. His stitches large and uneven, but strong. Maribel looked away, feeling as if she had intruded on a moment of private worship. She saw a man trying, with the only tools he had, to sew a broken world together for these children. A new sound pricked the evening quiet. It was the rhythmic clopping of a horse, but it wasn't Jesse's. Maribel looked out past the corral. A lone rider sat on the low ridge to the west, silhouetted against the last of the fading sunlight. He was too far away to make out his features, but he was not a neighbor. Neighbors rode up to the gate. This man was watching. He sat perfectly still, his attention fixed not on the house, but on the large barn and the adjoining sheds. Maribel felt a sudden, cold prickle run down her spine. The valley, which had felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt exposed. The man watched for a full minute. Then, with a slow pull on the reins, he turned his horse and disappeared back over the ridge. It was a small, unsettling thing. A single sour note in the day's quiet song. A little thorn stuck in the side of their newfound peace. That night, dinner was a quiet affair. The four of them gathered around the heavy table. A large pot of beans and bacon steamed in the center. For a long time, the only sounds were the scrape of spoons against tin plates. Jesse spoke little, as was his way, but Maribel was becoming fluent in his silences. Tonight, she felt his gaze on her more than usual. When she looked up, he didn't immediately look away. His eyes, in the lamplight, were no longer just sad or solitary. They were assessing, thoughtful. "The lessons," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're good. Bertie ain't so quiet." "She's bright," Maribel said, her heart warming. "They both are." Tommy kept the pencil. Jesse noted. "Yes," Maribel said. He kept the pencil. A small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. But it was enough. It was an alliance. Later, in her small room, Maribel lit her candle. She took out her worn, leather-bound journal. She dipped her pen in the ink pot and thought back on the day, the laughter under the aspen, the child's weight in her arms, the sight of a rough-handed man sewing a doll's dress, and the shadow on the hill. She wrote October 4th, 1883. The rhythms here are slow, but they are deep. This place lacks many things: glass in all the windows, sugar for the tea, words for the things that matter most. But it does not lack kindness, the fragile peace of the Coyote's Mercy Ranch, woven together by routine and the quiet cadence of lessons under the aspen tree, was torn apart on a Tuesday. The day had begun like any other, the air still and dry, the lessons turning from letters to simple arithmetic. Birdie was proudly counting pebbles into a tin cup, and Tommy, pencil in hand, was laboriously scrawling a list of words: barn, horse, water. They heard the riders before they saw them. It was not the familiar, solitary rhythm of Jesse's return. This was the sound of multiple horses, moving at an official, deliberate walk. Maribel instinctively put a hand on Birdie's shoulder. Tommy stood up, his eyes narrowing toward the trail. 4 riders crested the low ridge. 3 wore the dust-covered, functional attire of the territory. The man in the lead, however, was different. He rode tall, his back rigid, a silver star gleaming dully on his vest. This was Deputy Vance Mercer, a man whose authority was derived not from the respect of the land, but from the book of statutes he carried in his saddlebag. The 4th man hung back, separating himself from the group. He was not dressed for ranch work. He wore a dark, vested suit and a bowler hat, looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of sagebrush and dust. His hands, resting on the pommel of his expensive saddle, were pale and smooth. This was Silas Rook, a name spoken in hushed tones at Miller's trading post. He was the bank, the rumored stakeholder in the coming railroad, a man who saw the Red Willow Basin not as a home, but as a resource to be carved and sold. Jesse emerged from the barn, a piece of harness leather still in his hand. He stopped, his body going utterly still, his eyes fixed on the intruders. He placed the leather on a fence post with deliberate calm, then walked to the center of the yard, placing himself between the riders and the porch where Maribel stood with the children. "Calder," Mercer said. His voice was flat and cold, carrying no warmth, only the dry scrape of official business. He did not dismount. "Mercer," Jesse replied, his tone equally level. "Official county business." Mercer unrolled a thick sheaf of papers from his saddlebag. The documents were bound with a ribbon and stamped with a heavy, intimidating wax seal. He began to read, his voice cutting through the stillness. "By the authority of the Buckhorn Gap County Magistrate and the recently enacted Territorial Welfare Mandate, we are here to conduct an inspection of the premises regarding the status of the unindentured minors residing at this location." Maribel felt her blood run cold. Welfare mandate. It sounded so civilized, so benevolent. She knew, with the certainty of instinct, that it was a weapon. Inspection. Jesse's voice was dangerously quiet. "That's right." Mercer scanned the yard, his gaze lingering on the dilapidated chicken coop and the patched roof of the porch. "We've had reports." From behind him, Silas Rook watched, silent, his gaze fixed not on the children, but on the creek bed that bordered the property, the only reliable source of water in the entire basin. "Furthermore," Mercer continued, his voice hardening, "our records show no formal papers of guardianship for either child. Thomas Pike, age 9, Birdie, age unknown, presumed 6. You have no legal claim to them. Calder." Jesse's hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, slowly clenched into fists. "Claim." "They are wards of the territory," Mercer said, as if speaking of livestock. "And this ranch," he gestured dismissively, "fails to meet the new standards of welfare. It is deemed unsuitable." The word hung in the air, unsuitable. It was a judgment, cold and final. delivered by a man who had never spent a night under its roof. You're to appear at the courthouse in Buckhorn Gap on the 1st of next month, Mercer concluded. He refastened the papers and slid them into his bag. A hearing will determine the children's placement. Be advised, failure to appear will result in their immediate removal. He didn't wait for a reply. He wheeled his horse, the other deputies following suit. Silas Rook paused for a moment, his pale eyes meeting Maribel's across the yard. A small, satisfied smile played at the corners of his mouth. Then he, too, turned and rode away, leaving a cloud of choking dust and shattered silence in his wake. Tommy ran. He didn't make a sound. He just bolted for the barn, disappearing into the shadows. Bertie, understanding only the sudden, terrifying shift in the adults, buried her face in Maribel's skirt and began to tremble. That night, the ranch was suffocated by a tension that was thicker than the darkness. Dinner was a silent, wretched affair. Tommy had refused to come out of the barn until Jesse had gone in and spoken to him in a low voice. Now he sat at the table, pushing his beans around his plate, his face a mask of stone. Bertie wouldn't eat, only whimpering softly into her cup. After Maribel had finally coaxed Bertie to sleep, she found Jesse on the front porch. He was not sitting on the bench. He was sitting on the lowest step, his back to the house, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen. He looked, for the first time, defeated. She sat on the bench above him, not speaking, simply offering her presence in the heavy darkness. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. "I don't know, paper, Miss Quinn," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He was speaking to the darkness, to the uncaring prairie. "I know cattle, I know fences, I know the look of a bad winter, but this I don't know." He took a long, shuddering breath. "They say I got no claim. They're right." Maribel waited. She knew this was a dam breaking, a confession held back by years of solitary endurance. "Tommy," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I found him. It was 3 years ago. The old Pike granary, east of the basin. It went up in flames, caused by lightning. They said, or maybe a lantern." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "I rode over to help. It was just chaos. People yelling, animals screaming. Took 2 days to put it out." He rubbed his face with his calloused hands. When it was done, everyone was gone. The Pikes, his folks, they just left, fled, took their wagon and went. And I found him, hiding in an empty water trough, black with soot. He was 6. He didn't speak for a month. He shook his head, the memory heavy on him. "I brought him here, fed him, gave him a bed. What else was I to do? File a paper?" Maribel's heart ached. She watched the rigid line of his back. "And Bertie," he continued, his voice even softer. "That was the next winter, a hard one. Rode into town for supplies. Parson Whitlock flagged me down. Someone had left her on the church steps. Just left her in a fruit crate, wrapped in a thin blanket, near frozen. There was a note, said, 'God forgive me,' and nothing else. She was so small. You could hold her in one hand." He looked down at his own large, rough hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "The parson, he has no wife, no way to care for her, and I had the milk from my cow. I'd just taken Tommy, seemed wrong to leave her, so I brought her home too." He finally turned, looking up at Maribel, his eyes agonizingly clear in the faint starlight. "I'm not their blood, Miss Quinn. I'm just the man who was there. Mercer's right. It's not a claim. It's just a responsibility. And now they're going to take him from me." Maribel felt a surge of something hot and fierce in her chest. It was not pity. It was rage. She moved from the bench and sat on the step beside him, her skirts settling in the dust. "Mr. Calder," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through his despair. The law is sometimes blind. It sees only ink and paper. It does not see a man sitting up all night with a sick child. It does not see a boy who finally learned to smile again. It does not see the stitches you sewed in a doll's dress. He looked at her, startled. So, she continued, we will have to teach it to see. You know the land. I know words. They have come here with their paper. We will fight them with our own. The next morning, the fog of despair had been replaced by a sharp, focused energy. Maribel took out her last sheets of good linen paper and her ink pot. She began to write. She drafted a petition, her handwriting clear and precise. We, the undersigned, neighbors and residents of the Red Willow Basin, do hereby attest to the character of Mr. Jesse Calder and to his unwavering care and provision for the children, Thomas Pike and Bertie. She knew she needed signatures. She needed the community to stand against the county. I'm writing to Miller's Trading Post, she announced to Jesse, and to the widow Alma Ridge. I will get every signature in this basin. Jesse watched her, a spark of something returning to his eyes. He nodded. I'll write out, he said, his voice firm again. I'll see what I can get for the new calves. If we're going to fight this, we need a lawyer, a real one. But they both knew the bitter truth. The drought that had plagued the basin all summer had left the grazing sparse. The calves were thin, and the market price in Buckhorn Gap had plummeted. Selling them now would be a financial sacrifice, one that might not even be enough. The true poison of Mercer's visit, however, had already seeped into the foundations of the ranch. Maribel rode to Miller's, the petition tucked safely in her bag. The trading post was busy, a hub of commerce and, more importantly, information. As she gathered signatures from ranchers and their wives, she began to hear the whispers. The rumors flew like dry leaves in a windstorm. It ain't about the children. Miss Quinn. Old Mrs. Miller told her, her voice low as she signed her name with a shaky hand. It's Silas Rook. He wants the water. The water? The railroad. Dear, it's coming through the South Pass, and it needs water. A lot of water. Rook's been buying up every property that touches a creek. All except Coyote's Mercy. Jesse's land has the best springhead in the basin. Another rancher added, his voice bitter. Rook already holds the old mortgage on Jesse's land, from the previous owner, before Jesse even got here. He's been looking for a way to foreclose, but Jesse's never missed a payment. This welfare business, it's just Rook's new lever to pull. And then, the darkest rumor of all, the one that made Maribel's stomach clench. They'll send him to Cheyenne Haven, a woman whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she looked at her own child. That's where the county sends the wards. Cheyenne Haven, Maribel asked. It's not a home, Miss Quinn. Mrs. Miller said, her face grim. It's a workhouse, a brick factory for orphans. They don't come back from there. Not whole. The ride back to the ranch was cold. Despite the afternoon sun, Maribel now understood the true nature of the fight. This wasn't about welfare. It was about greed, corruption, and a strip of railroad track. The children were not the reason. They were the leverage. When she returned, the house was silent. Too silent. Tommy, she called. Bertie? She found them in the main room. Bertie was huddled in the corner by the cold hearth, clutching her corn-husked doll, her small body racked with silent, terrified sobs. Tommy was standing by his cot. He had a small burlap sack, the one he used to collect eggs, and he was filling it with his meager possessions, a jackknife, the pencil she had given him, and a stale piece of bread. He had heard Jesse and Maribel talking in hushed, anxious tones after she returned. He had heard the words lawyer and sell the calves, and, worst of all, Cheyenne Haven. His small face was pale, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He was preparing to run again. Maribel's heart broke. The legal papers, the politics, the greed had all vanished. All that was left was this small boy, already betrayed by the world once. now preparing to face it alone rather than be caged. And the little girl, crying for a home she was about to lose. Maribel walked over to Tommy. She didn't try to stop him. She knelt in front of him, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, but his defiance was absolute. "They are not taking you," she said. Her voice was not the soft voice of a teacher. It was low, fierce, and vibrating with a promise that was as solid as the earth beneath them. Tommy just stared at her, his breathing shallow. "Do you hear me? Tommy Pike," she said, placing her hands on his small, rigid shoulders. "They are not taking you, and they are not taking Birdie. They will have to come through me first." Birdie's sobs hitched. She looked up, her tear-streaked face full of desperate hope. Maribel pulled them both close, her arms encircling them. Tommy resisted for a moment, his body stiff as a board, before he finally collapsed against her, his hands gripping her dress. Birdie scrambled to join them, wrapping her tiny arms around Maribel's neck. "No one," Maribel whispered, her voice like steel, her eyes staring at the cold hearth. "No one is going to separate us, not as long as I am breathing." The threat did not come on horseback. It came from the sky. For days, the air had been heavy and close, the sun a pale, hazy disk behind a scrim of high, thin clouds. It was a weather of omens, a sky that promised violence without relief. It was the season of the dry thunderstorm. The storm rolled in from the west in the late afternoon, a bruised, purple mass of clouds that scudded across the landscape, trailing curtains of verga that evaporated long before they could touch the parched earth. There was no life-giving rain in these clouds, only fury. The wind rose, hot and frantic, whipping dust and dry leaves into frenzied spirals. The world grew dark, an unnatural twilight that made the cattle nervous and the children quiet. Then came the lightning. It was not the majestic, sky-splitting bolts of a summer rainstorm. This was jagged and vicious, striking the ground with sharp, explosive cracks that sounded like a rifle shot next to the ear. The first strike hit the western ridge, a spider web of pure, white energy. A moment later, a second bolt, thicker and more malevolent, struck the prairie a half-mile from the ranch house. It touched the cured, tinder-dry grass, and the world exploded. The fire did not start. It was born. One moment there was nothing. The next, a wall of incandescent orange shot 50 feet into the air with a deafening roar. It moved with terrifying speed, a ravenous beast consuming everything in its path, driven by the hot, angry wind. "Inside!" Jesse's voice was a bellow, a raw command that cut through the wind's howl. He was already running from the barn, his face a mask of grim urgency. "Maribel, get them inside." Maribel grabbed Birdie's hand, her other arm circling Tommy's shoulders. "Come on, now!" But Tommy pulled away. His face was white with fear, but his eyes were wide with a dawning horror of his own. "The calf!" he cried, his voice thin and reedy against the fire's roar. "The new one." With a white face, she wandered off toward the creek bed. The creek bed was directly in the fire's path. "Tommy, no!" Jesse roared. "It's too late." But the boy was already gone, spurred by a desperate, childish sense of duty. He scrambled off the porch and sprinted toward the corrals, a small, determined figure running toward the apocalypse. "Damn it!" The curse was torn from Jesse's throat. He didn't waste another second. He turned and ran back to the barn, emerging a moment later on the back of his fastest cutting horse, a lean, intelligent pinto that seemed to understand the terror of the moment. Without a saddle, clinging to the horse's mane, Jesse galloped after the boy, a lone rider charging into a sea of fire and smoke. Maribel watched them go, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. For a paralyzing instant, she was frozen by the sheer, overwhelming horror of it. The roar of the flames, the acrid smell of burning grass, the sight of the man and the boy disappearing into a curtain of thick, black smoke. Then the teacher in her took over. The part of her that knew order must be imposed on chaos. The part that knew terror could be fought with action. "Birdie," she said, her voice sharp and clear, pulling the terrified girl back from the brink of hysteria. "Listen to me. We have work to do. We need water." She dragged the child, who was stumbling and crying, to the hand pump in the center of the yard. "You see this handle? I'm going to push it up and down. Water will come out here. You will take the bucket, and you will fill it. Can you do that for me?" Birdie, her face streaked with tears and grime, nodded, her eyes huge and unblinking. Maribel began to pump. The iron handle was stiff and cold, the work grueling. Her arms and back protested immediately, but with each rhythmic squeak and groan of the mechanism, a gush of life-saving water poured into the bucket, up and down, a frantic prayer against the inferno. Birdie, her small hands struggling, dragged the first full bucket away from the spout. "Good girl," Maribel shouted over the roar. "Now, the next one." They worked in a desperate, frantic rhythm. Maribel's muscles screamed, her lungs burned, but she did not stop. She pushed her body past exhaustion, her mind focused on the simple, brutal task. Pump, fill, again. Birdie, her fear forgotten in the face of purpose, dutifully dragged each full bucket a few feet away, creating a small arsenal against the flames. The fire was closer now, the heat a physical blow. Embers, like malevolent fireflies, rained down around them. The smoke was a choking, blinding fog. Maribel knew the pump and buckets alone would not be enough. She looked toward the wall of flame, a solid, moving cliff of destruction, and saw a chance, a narrow one. The wind was driving the main fire front in a line. If Jesse and Tommy could cut east, they might be able to outrun the flank, but the flames were already licking at the grass in their path. "Stay here. Birdie, keep filling," she commanded. She ran to the clothesline. Ripping a heavy wool blanket from its pins, she plunged it into one of the full buckets, the water turning instantly gray. The blanket was incredibly heavy, a dead, sodden weight. Grunting with the effort, she hauled it from the bucket and ran toward the edge of the fire. The heat was unlike anything she had ever known. It baked her skin, seared her lungs, and made her eyes stream. She could see them now. Through a gap in the smoke, Jesse had found Tommy. He had the boy in front of him on the horse, but they were trapped. The fire was closing in, a pincer movement of orange and black. With a cry that was part fury and part prayer, Maribel began to fight. She swung the heavy, wet blanket like a flail, bringing it down on the creeping edge of the fire. Whump! A section of flame hissed and died, replaced by a cloud of bitter steam. She swung again. Whump! And again. Whump! It was brutal, punishing work. The blanket was a monstrous weight, and the steam that rose was scalding. But it was working. She was beating a path, a narrow, blackened trail of survival, yard by painful yard. Through the smoke, she saw Jesse urge the horse forward, into the path she was clearing. They were coming. They were almost there. And then, a new sound, a terrible, groaning crack that rose above the fire's roar. The ancient, half-dead cottonwood tree at the edge of the creek bed, its roots baked and its trunk superheated, gave way. It fell with agonizing slowness, a giant, flaming torch, directly into their path. Tommy screamed. Jesse reacted without thought. In a single, fluid motion, he twisted his body, covering the boy with his own. He took the full, glancing blow of a massive, burning limb across his back and shoulder. The horse screamed, stumbling but miraculously keeping its feet. Jesse grunted, a sound of pure agony, but he held on, his arms a vice around Tommy. They cleared the falling tree, galloping onto the blackened patch of ground Maribel had fought for. They were through. They were safe from the main fire. Just then, new shouts cut through the chaos. A wagon, pulled by two lathered horses, came careening into the ranch yard. It was Widow Alma Ridge, her stern, weathered face set in a grim mask of determination. 2 of her grown sons with her, armed with shovels and wet burlap sacks. The community had come. They were not the only arrivals. On the ridge overlooking the ranch, the same ridge where the lone rider had watched them days before, sat a single figure on horseback. It was Deputy Vance Mercer. He was not riding to help. He was observing, a small notebook in his hand, a cold, clinical witness to their disaster. He was watching the unsuitable home go up in flames, documenting every second of it. The fight was not over. The fire was bearing down on the barn. Alma and her sons, joined by Jessie, who had slid, grimacing, from the horse, began to dig a fire break. Maribel, her strength all but gone, continued to beat at the encroaching flames with her scorched and tattered blanket. And then, a miracle. The first drop of rain was a fluke, a random splatter in the dust that hissed and evaporated. Then another, and another. The sky, which had only offered fury, suddenly opened. The rain came down, not a gentle shower, but a torrential, cleansing downpour. The effect was instantaneous. The roar of the fire was replaced by a massive, collective hiss. Steam rose in dense, white clouds, smelling of ash and wet earth. The wall of orange became a field of black, smoking embers. The rain fell harder, washing the soot from the air, turning the dust to mud. The fire was dying. They stood in the downpour, all of them too exhausted to move, too stunned to speak. The blackened landscape steamed around them. In the pasture, the herd of young calves, which had been huddled in terror at the far fence, began to bleat, their coats slick with rain. They were frightened, but they were alive. Inside the kitchen, the world shrank to the small circle of light cast by a single lantern. The rain drummed a steady, soothing rhythm on the roof. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, mud, and the sharp, medicinal scent of the burn salve Maribel had found in a tin box. Jesse sat hunched at the table, his shirt stripped off. The burn that covered his left shoulder and a portion of his back was an ugly, angry red, blistered and weeping. He had not made a sound as Maribel had gently washed the ash and grime away. He remained silent now as she carefully, tenderly, applied the cool, greasy salve. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped along his cheek. His right hand, resting on the tabletop, was gripping the wooden edge so hard his knuckles were white. Maribel's hands were gentle. All the ferocity she had shown fighting the fire had been replaced by an infinite, focused tenderness. She finished her work, laying a clean piece of linen over the wound. She placed her hand on his good shoulder, the warmth of her palm seeping through the thin fabric of his undershirt. He flinched slightly, but did not pull away. "You feel the pain here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let me keep the peace for the rest." He slowly unclenched his hand from the table. He did not look at her, but he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of a shared burden that went far beyond a physical wound. The shared ordeal had reforged them. It had burned away the layers of caution and distance, leaving something raw and fundamental in its place. When Tommy, wrapped in a dry blanket, came and stood silently by Jesse's side, his small hand resting on the man's knee, it was the gesture of a son. When Birdie, her face scrubbed clean, leaned her head against Maribel's lap, it was the trust of a daughter. They were no longer 4 separate, wounded souls adrift in a lonely valley. They were a unit, fused together by smoke and fire and fear, and the stubborn, desperate will to survive. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, the rain stopped. The clouds cleared, revealing a sky scrubbed clean and littered with a billion stars. From the direction of the creek bed, a new sound arose. It was the tentative, then triumphant, chorus of frogs, their voices rising from the wet, blackened earth. It was the sound of life stubbornly reasserting itself in the face of destruction. It was the sound of a promise, made in silence and sealed in fire, that this place, this family, would endure. The ranch was profoundly quiet. The rain had scrubbed the air clean, leaving behind the sharp, clean scent of wet earth, pine resin, and the bitter, lingering smell of ash. The western prairie was a vast, blackened scar under the faint, silvery sickle of the new moon. But the frogs, emboldened by the drenching, sang a deafening, unified chorus from the creek bed. It was the sound of life refusing to be silenced. Inside the small house, the silence was of a different kind. It was the heavy, deep sleep of exhaustion and relief. In their shared room, Tommy and Bertie were lost to the world, their breathing slow and even. They had survived. Maribel sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of mint tea she didn't taste. Her body ached in places she didn't know she had, her muscles screaming from the exertion of the pump and the heavy, sodden blanket. The fire had burned something away in her, to the last of her lingering detachment. She was no longer a visitor. She had fought for this ground, for these children. She had laid her own claim. She heard a floorboard creak on the porch. "Jesse!" He had been out in the darkness for the last hour, checking on the nervous cattle, assessing the damage to the fence line. She had watched him from the window, a solitary figure moving through the moonlight, his left arm held stiffly at his side, a testament to the pain he would not voice. The door opened softly. He stood in the doorway, framed by the deep indigo of the night. He was not looking at her, but at his own feet, as if uncertain. In his good hand, he held something she didn't recognize at first. It was an old guitar, its wood scarred and dark, missing a string. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the dim lamplight. His gaze was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it she had never seen, a profound hesitation. "They're asleep," she whispered, stating the obvious. He nodded. I need to—" He stopped, the words failing him. He was a man who spoke in actions, in fence posts and tamed horses, not in the currency of feelings. "Would you walk with me, Miss Quinn?" It was a formal request, almost stiff, but the tone beneath it was not. It was a plea. "Of course, Mr. Calder." She set her cup down and followed him outside. The cool night air felt shockingly good on her skin, still warm and raw from the fire. He didn't lead her to the front porch, where the world could see them. He walked slowly, favoring his injured side, around the side of the house, past the silent barn, to a small, grassy patch of ground that overlooked the creek. The sound of the frogs was louder here. He sat on a large, flat stone, wincing slightly as he settled his weight. He placed the guitar on his knee, his large, calloused fingers awkward on the fretboard. Maribel stood before him, her hands clasped, waiting. He strummed. The sound was thin and clumsy. 2 strings were badly out of tune, and his fingers, used to the brutal simplicity of rope and leather, were stiff. He plucked a simple, halting melody, a few notes of an old folk song she barely recognized. He was not playing for her. He was playing at the gratitude he could not express. The music was terrible, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. He stopped, his hand resting on the strings, silencing them. He stared at his own hand, at the burns and scars, as if he could will the right words to come through it. "I ain't good with talk," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "What you did today, for Tommy, for the barn, for all of it, a man." He shook his head, frustrated. He looked up at her, his eyes clear and dark in the faint starlight. "This place was just wood and dirt. Before you came, it was just a place to be, a place to keep, breathing." He took a slow breath, as if the air itself was new to him. "You make the house breathe, Maribel." Her name. He had never used her given name before. It landed in the quiet air with a physical weight. It was a simple, short compliment, delivered without flourish, and it undid her. It was the truest, most profound thanks she had ever received. He wasn't thanking her for her actions. He was thanking her for her presence.
"Jessie,"
she whispered. He rose slowly from the stone. Letting the guitar slide gently to the grass, he stood in front of her, closer than they had ever stood before. He was so tall, a solid, warm presence in the cool night. She could smell the wood smoke in his clothes, the sharp scent of the salve on his skin, and the clean, honest smell of the man himself. Their breaths mingled in the small, silvery space between them. The tension was no longer the sharp, acrid fear of the fire. It was something else entirely, a thrumming, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the damp earth itself. Her hand, acting of its own accord, lifted. She needed to know he was real. She needed to bridge this last, infinitesimal gap. Her fingers, still smudged with soot, rose to his shoulder, lightly, tentatively, tracing the edge of the linen bandage she had placed there. Even through the cloth, she could feel the heat of his skin, the tight bundle of his muscle. Her fingers trembled. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her hand, then back to her eyes. He saw the tremor. He saw the question in her touch. He did not move. He simply asked, his voice low and certain,
"Is this all right?"
It was not a question of passion. It was a question of permission, of respect. He was giving her the choice. He was offering her the power, a thing no one else had ever done. Maribel did not, could not, speak. She gave her answer. A slow, deliberate nod, her eyes wide and clear, never left his. It was not a surrender. It was an acceptance, a choice. Yes. He moved with the same slow, deliberate grace she had seen him use on his horse. He bent his head. His hand, the good one, came up and gently, so gently, cupped the side of her face. His thumb, rough as bark, stroked her cheekbone, and then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fire and desperate hunger. It was a kiss of drought breaking. It was warm and long and achingly gentle. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. His lips were chapped from the elements, but soft, and they tasted faintly of the mint tea she had made. He was restrained, as if he knew his own strength and was terrified of damaging something so delicate. But beneath the restraint, she felt the deep, steady current of a longing held in check for years. She felt the solitude, the loss, and the quiet endurance he had carried alone. In that kiss, her own walls, the ones she had built so carefully around the hollow ache inside her, crumbled into dust. The grief of her barrenness, the fear of Silas Rook, the weariness of her wandering life, it all dissolved. When the kiss finally ended, they did not move apart. He rested his forehead against hers. His breath was warm on her face. His hand was still on her cheek, his thumb now tracing the line of her jaw. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the man, stripped of his solitude, his defenses down, his calloused hands, hands that had fought fire and sewn a doll's dress, moved from her face to her waist. They rested there for a moment, large and warm, spanning the width of her. He did not ask with words this time. His gaze was the question. His fingers found the small, bone buttons and the worn tie that fastened the waistband of her heavy wool skirt. It was the last piece of her armor, the fabric that separated her from the world, the uniform of the wandering, childless teacher. His fingers fumbled. For just a second, his nerves betrayed by the unfamiliar, delicate task, and then, with a steady, reverent touch, he unfastened the tie. The small sound of the knot giving way, of the fabric easing, was shockingly loud in the vast quiet. A wave of emotion so potent, so overwhelming, washed over Maribel. It was a feeling of being utterly seen, utterly known, and completely safe. She bit her lip, a sharp, involuntary check against the sudden tightness in her throat, against the tears that sprang to her eyes. It was not a bite of shyness or fear. It was a bite to anchor herself against the powerful, grounding realization that she was, at last, home. He had unfastened the barrier, and yet he did not pull. He did not take. He simply waited. With a small sound, a sigh that was half a sob, she moved. She stepped into him, her arms wrapping around his strong, solid torso, her hands spreading wide against the muscles of his back, careful of his injured shoulder. She pressed her face into the warm hollow of his good shoulder, inhaling his scent. His arms enveloped her, his good arm holding her tightly against him, his other resting protectively on her lower back. He held her as if she were the miracle, not the rain. They stood there, two solitary figures, no longer solitary, holding each other in the moonlight. His chin came to rest on her temple, a gesture of pure, protective tenderness. They fit, as if they had been carved from the same piece of wood. They swayed slightly, a slow, unconscious movement, a dance without music, their bodies learning the rhythm of the other. "I thought my heart was closed," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I thought that part of me was barren too, like all the rest." He held her tighter, his hand stroking her hair. "Turns out," she murmured, her eyes closing, "it was just waiting. It was just waiting for the right person." He said nothing. He had no words for the feeling. He just held her, pouring all of his gratitude, all of his protection, all of his years of loneliness into the simple, solid embrace. They stood like that for a long time, while the moon crept higher and the frogs sang their relentless song of survival. Finally, they eased apart, just enough to look at each other. A slow smile touched Jesse's lips, a smile that transformed his rugged, stoic face, making him look years younger. Maribel smiled back, her own face wet with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. He touched his forehead to hers again, a gentle, solid contact, a promise. Then his good hand found hers, his calloused fingers lacing with her own. He picked up the forgotten guitar with his other hand. Wordlessly, they walked back to the house, their joined hands swinging gently between them. The night was still dangerous. The world, embodied by men like Silas Rook and Vance Mercer, was still waiting to tear them apart. But as they stepped onto the porch, bathed in the warm, yellow light from the kitchen window, they were no longer facing it alone. They walked with the quiet, secret warmth of a promise made and accepted, a bond sealed by fire and water, and the simple, profound touch of a hand. The fragile, newfound intimacy of the night in the pasture settled into something stronger in the days that followed a partnership. The fire had burned away the pretense of Jesse Calder as a solitary rancher and Maribel Quinn as a wandering teacher. The disaster had forged them into a single, determined unit, and they now faced their true enemy not with passion, but with a cold, calculated strategy. While Jesse and a grateful Tommy worked from dawn until dusk, rebuilding the scorched section of fence line, Maribel turned the ranch house kitchen into a war room. Her weapons were no longer wet blankets and water buckets. They were ink, paper, and her sharp, methodical mind. The hearing in Buckhorn Gap loomed, less than 2 weeks away. Jesse had, years ago, filed for a copy of the old lien agreement that Silas Rook held on the property. It had been a formality then, something the previous, honest county clerk had provided without question. Now, it was Maribel's primary piece of evidence. For 2 nights, long after the children were asleep and Jesse had collapsed into his own cot, she sat by the low light of the lantern. The document spread on the table. It was dated 1877. Beside it, she placed her father's journal, dated 1875, and a deed for a family plot in New England from 1870. She was not a forger, but she was a woman of letters, intimately familiar with the tools of the trade. Something was wrong. She leaned in, the lantern light glinting off her spectacles. The ink on the 1877 lien was a uniform, flat black. It was too perfect. The ink in her father's journal, only 2 years older, had faded to a rusty brown, the iron gall ink oxidizing as it should. This ink, it was a newer, carbon-based formula, one that had only become common in the last year or two. She touched the paper. It was thick and felt sturdy, but when she held it to the light, she saw the tiny, almost invisible fibers embedded within it. They were too uniform, too short. They were wood pulp, paper in 1877, especially for a legal document of this importance. Would have been rag paper, made from linen and cotton. This was a newer, cheaper stock. But the final, damning clue was the county seal. She ran her fingertip over the impressed wax. It was sharp, precise, flawless. She compared it to the seal on an older document Jesse had, a bill of sale for his first bull. The old seal was slightly blurred, the wax a different, darker color. This new seal was a forgery, and a good one. But it was not the seal of 1877. The entire document was a fraud. Rook didn't just hold a debt, he had invented one. The next morning, she left Tommy and Bertie in the watchful care of widow Alma Ridge, who had ridden over with a basket of eggs and a fierce, protective glint in her eye. Maribel rode the buckboard into Buckhorn Gap, her destination not the courthouse, but the small, sun-baked church on its outskirts, St. Dusty Chapel. She found Parson Whitlock mending a broken pew. He was a thin, wiry man with a kind face and hands stained with varnish. He was the man who had placed the infant Bertie into Jessie's arms. "Miss Quinn," he greeted her, surprise in his voice. "I am glad to see you. I heard about the fire, a terrible thing." "Tom Parson," Maribel said, getting straight to the point. "I am not here for comfort. I am here for history. You keep the church records." "Of course. Births, deaths, baptisms. They go back to the founding of the town." "I need to see the baptismal ledger from 1877. His eyebrows rose, but he saw the urgency in her face and did not question it. He led her to a small office, where a massive, leather-bound book lay on a lectern. He opened it carefully, the dry pages whispering. "Here we are," he said, running a finger down the page. "March 1877. "I am not looking for a name," Maribel said, her heart pounding. "I am looking for a signature. The county clerk at the time, Mr. Abernathy. He would have been a witness, wouldn't he?" "Elijah Abernathy. Yes, a good man. He witnessed nearly every official event. Here he is, the baptism of Sarah Miller." Maribel pulled a piece of paper from her reticule. On it, she had carefully traced the signature from the forged lien. She laid it next to the ledger. They were close, to a casual observer. They were identical. But Maribel and the parson leaned in. "Look," Maribel whispered, her finger trembling as she pointed. "The F in Abernathy, on your ledger, the real one. The loop is open and wide. On the forgery, it's closed and tight." "And the T?" The parson breathed, catching on. "His T is crossed high, almost above the letter. This other one, it's crossed in the middle." "It's not his signature," Maribel said, the words landing like stones. "Silas Rook," the parson said, his face hardening. "This is his work. He is a rot in this county." That night, the rot made its presence known. Maribel was awakened by a sound, a scrape of metal on stone. She sat up, her heart leaping into her throat. Beside her, in the small room, Bertie stirred but did not wake. Jesse was already moving. She saw his shadow pass the kitchen window, his rifle in hand. He didn't go out the front. He slipped out the back, melting into the darkness by the water trough. Maribel moved to the window that overlooked the granary, the small shed where they kept their precious stores of flour, grain, and seed. Two men, they were moving in the deep shadows, carrying a heavy bucket between them. They weren't there to steal. They were too loud. They were there to destroy. One man pried the door of the granary open. The other began to splash a thick, dark liquid onto the sacks inside. It was tar, or creosote, something with a noxious, chemical smell that choked the air even from a distance. They were contaminating the food, creating the very unsafe and unsuitable conditions Mercer had accused them of. Suddenly, a small figure darted from the corner of the house. Tommy, he must have been having a nightmare. Or perhaps he'd heard the men, too. In his hand was a rock. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice high and cracking with terror and rage. He threw the rock. It struck the side of the shed with a loud thwack. The two men cursed, startled. One of them, a big burly man, turned toward Tommy and took a menacing step. "No," Maribel hissed. She ran from the house, not shouting, but moving low and fast. She grabbed Tommy by the shirt, yanking him backward off his feet and into the shadows of the woodpile. She clamped her hand over his mouth, her heart hammering against his small, trembling back. "Shh," she commanded, her voice a fierce whisper in his ear. The men, unnerved by the scream and the sudden silence, grabbed their bucket and fled, disappearing into the darkness. Maribel held Tommy for a long minute, her body shielding his. He was shaking, not with cold, but with a combination of fear and adrenaline. You let them get away," he whispered, his voice accusing. She finally released him, turning him to face her in the gloom. "Tommy, listen to me," she said, her voice sharp. "That was brave, and it was foolish. You cannot fight men like that with rocks. That is not how we win this." But they were. "I know. That's why we have to be smart. Being brave is easy. Being smart is hard. You must learn," she said, tapping his temple. "To be afraid in the right way. Be afraid of what they can do, so you don't give them the chance to do it. We didn't fight them. We saw them. We know what they're doing. Now, we have the advantage." He stared at her, the lesson sinking in. This was a new kind of fight, one that didn't involve fists, but wits. He nodded, his small jaw set. The next day, the fight moved back to the official channels. Jesse rode into Buckhorn Gap, his face grim. He was carrying the temporary guardianship application, meticulously drafted by Maribel, fortified with the signatures she and widow Alma had collected. Alma had been a force of nature. At the last market day, she had set up a table, ostensibly to sell her preserves, but really to collect support. She had cajoled, shamed, and inspired. The petition now bore the names of nearly every homesteader in the basin, a powerful testament to Jesse's character. Jesse walked into the county office. Deputy Mercer was seated behind the desk, his feet up, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. "Calder," he drawled, not bothering to stand. Jesse placed the packet of papers on the desk. "Application for guardianship, and a petition from my neighbors." Mercer sighed, as if burdened. He slowly leafed through the pages, his expression one of pure contempt. He looked at Alma's signature, then at the others. "A lot of paper," he said, unimpressed. He tapped the application. "This all seems mostly in order." He stopped, his eyes narrowing on a blank line. "However, you've forgotten the new supplemental administrative fee." "Fee?" Jesse said, his voice dangerously level. "There was no fee mentioned on the forms." "It's a recent addendum," Mercer said, his smile thin and unpleasant. "For welfare cases involving non-familial wards, expedited processing." "How much?" Jesse asked, though he already knew the answer. $50. Jesse's hand clenched. $50 was a fantasy. It was more than he could get for his entire calf crop. It was a bribe, plain and simple, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who held all the power. "I don't have it," Jesse said, the words tasting like ash. "Pity," Mercer said, tossing the application into a drawer. "Then I'm afraid this will have to wait for Review. And the hearing is on the first. Tisk. He went back to cleaning his nails. Jesse stood there for a long, vibrating moment, his desire to pull the man over the desk a physical force. But he saw Maribel's face in his mind. Be smart. He turned, without a word, and walked out. Maribel met him on the porch when he returned. She saw the answer in the rigid set of his shoulders. He wouldn't file it. She stated, "He wants $50. Jesse said, his voice flat. Maribel nodded, her mind already working. Then we go around him. She bundled her own papers, her notes on the forgery, the tracing of the signature. I'm going back to town, to Gus Harrow. Gus Harrow was the town printer, a quiet, bespectacled man who ran the Buckhorn Gap Courier. He loved his printing press more than people, and he hated corruption more than anything. She laid out her findings on his ink-stained counter. He listened, his eyes growing wider as he examined her evidence. This is treason, nearly," he whispered. "Falsifying a county seal." "I need copies, Mr. Harrow," Maribel said. "If Rook knows I have this, he'll take it. He'll burn it. I need it safe." "I can't photograph it," he said. "But I can do better." He pulled out a fresh lithography stone. "I will make a press proof, an exact, detailed copy of the signatures and the seal. I'll print 5 copies. I'll hide 4. 1 for you, 1 for me, and 3 for the earth itself." As Maribel rode home, her evidence secured, the sky turned a familiar, bruised yellow. The trauma of the fire was still fresh, and the tension in the air was palpable. That night, Bertie woke up screaming. It wasn't a normal nightmare. She was burning with fever, her small body drenched in sweat. Maribel's heart seized, the smoke, the terror, the night of the fire. It had all been too much for her little body. "It's here!" Bertie cried, her eyes wide and delirious, pointing at the shadows in the corner. "The orange man, he's coming!" "No, sweetling, no," Maribel soothed, her hands shaking as she dipped a rag in a bowl of cool water. "It's gone. The rain came. You're safe." But the fever had her, for the rest of the night. Maribel sat in a vigil. She bathed Bertie's face, murmuring the old New England lullaby about the river, her voice a low, steady anchor in the child's delirium. The house was silent save for the child's pained breathing and the scratch of Maribel's pen. She did not stop. One hand held the cool cloth to her daughter's forehead. The other, propped up on a book, drafted the legal argument she would present to the judge. She wrote about the forged lien. She wrote about the community's support. She wrote about Jesse's care, about the granary, about Mercer's bribe. She was a mother and a lawyer, and she would not fail at either. Near dawn, the fever broke. Bertie's breathing deepened into a true, healing sleep. Maribel let her head fall onto the edge of the cot, just for a moment, her exhaustion total. She felt a hand on her shoulder. "Jesse." He stood beside her, his face gray with worry. He had been checking the livestock, but his gaze had been fixed on the house. He looked at the sleeping child, then at the stack of papers Maribel had written. He sat down heavily at the table, running his hands over his face. He looked broken. "I can tie a splint," he said, his voice rough. "I know how to rope a steer in a blizzard. I know how to tie a horse so he won't break free." He reached out and touched the stack of legal papers, his calloused fingertips brushing the ink. "But I don't know how to tie the law. Maribel, I don't know how to fight this." Maribel, running on pure, uncut will, stood up. She walked over to him and took his large, sun-baked hand in both of hers. She felt the scars, the strength, the deep, trembling fear. She looked him square in the eye. "Then you let me tie the law, Jesse," she said, her voice quiet but unbreakable. She squeezed his hand, pouring her own strength into him. "You just tie the faith." Silas Rook was not a man who accepted setbacks with grace. Defiance, to him, was not a challenge to be met with respect, but an insult to be punished. Jesse Calder had refused to be bought, and Maribel Quinn had refused to be intimidated. Their community had refused to be cowed. The law was proving to be a slow, blunt instrument. So Rook sharpened a faster, hotter one fear. The attack came 2 nights after Jesse's return from Buckhorn Gap, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky. It was not a direct assault on the house. It was more insidious, a single, towering haystack. The product of a summer's hard labor and the vital winter feed for the cattle, stood 100 yards from the barn. A sudden, brilliant flash of orange lit up the yard, followed by a hungry whoosh as the dry hay ignited. Jesse was on the porch in an instant, not with a bucket, but with his rifle. He saw them then. 2 riders, their faces masked by kerchiefs, already galloping away from their handiwork, their silhouettes stark against the towering pillar of flame. "It's a pretext," Maribel said, coming up behind him, her voice tight with cold fury. "To prove the ranch is hazardous. To give Mercer another reason." "They won't get one," Jesse said. His voice was utterly calm, the kind of calm that comes when all doubt has been burned away. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the firelight. "Can you ride, Maribel? Can you ride hard?" She didn't hesitate. "Show me the horse." He saddled the pinto for himself and a spirited but steady mare, a lovely dapple gray named Gray Belle, for her. "Stay with me," he commanded. "Do not fall behind." They rode out not toward the fire, but into the darkness, circling wide to cut off the arsonist's escape route through the rocky badlands to the north. The fire behind them cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar landscape into a hellish, alien world. The wind carried the stench of burning hay and the triumphant, whooping laughter of the 2 riders. That laughter died when Jesse and Maribel crested a ridge and appeared directly in their path. The 2 men, startled, reined in their horses. For a moment, they were frozen in a tableau of surprise. Then, one of them, the larger of the 2, drew his pistol. They were in Vulture Narrows, a tight, winding canyon of sheer rock walls that amplified every sound. The man's horse, spooked by the sudden appearance of new riders, shied and danced. He was a hired hand, not a gunman, and his panic was evident. "Don't be a fool," Jesse's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. It was the voice of a man in absolute command of the situation. The man hesitated, his pistol wavering. That was all the time Jesse needed. He wasn't aiming for the man. He was aiming for his pride. Jesse's rifle cracked. A single, sharp report that slammed back and forth between the rock walls. It was not a sound of random violence. It was a sound of absolute precision. The larger man's hat flew from his head. A neat, round hole punched clean through the felt brim. The hat spun in the air and landed in the dust. The man stared, his hand dropping, his face a mask of pure terror. His companion, seeing his partner so easily and contemptuously outmatched, wanted no part of the fight. He spun his horse and bolted, galloping wildly back the way he came. The first man, his nerve utterly broken, scrambled to follow, leaving his hat and his dignity behind in the dust. They were gone. As the sound of their frantic hoofbeats faded, an unnatural quiet descended on the canyon. "Are you all right?" Jesse asked, turning to Maribel. "I am," she said, her voice a little shaky, her hands gripping the reins tightly. Then her eyes fixed on something on the ground near where the first man's horse had shied, a small, dark shape in the moonlight. "Jesse, look!" She dismounted, her legs unsteady, and walked to the spot. It was a leather pouch, its drawstring pulled open. That must have fallen from the man's saddlebag in his panic. She picked it up. Her blood ran cold. Inside was not money. The first thing she pulled out was a heavy, intricately carved metal stamp. It was a county seal, the forged county seal. The second item was a wicked-looking skinning knife. Carved crudely into the bone handle were 2 initials S R. And the third, tucked into a side pocket, was a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a receipt, written in a spidery hand, for $25. It was torn in half. At the bottom, where the recipient's name should be, was only half a signature, but the letters were unmistakable. C.E. Mercer. Proof. Maribel breathed, her voice filled with a terrible, triumphant awe. Jessie, we have it all. The seal, Rook's initial, the bribe. We have them. Jessie dismounted and took the items from her, his face grim. And they know they lost it. He looked down the canyon, in the direction the men had fled. They'll be back for this, and they won't be looking to scare us next time. We need to get home. They mounted and rode, not with the frantic speed of the chase, but with a new, heightened urgency. They had the weapon that could win the war, and now they were the targets. They were halfway back, approaching the old wooden bridge that spanned the shallow, rocky expanse of Willow Creek, when the trap was sprung. It was not a confrontation. It was an ambush. 2 rifle shots exploded from the thicket of willows on the far side of the bridge, the bullets splintering the wooden railing inches from Jessie's head. The Pinto screamed and reared. There were 4 of them this time, spread out, cutting off their retreat. Rook had not wasted any time. The creek, Jessie roared. There was no time to turn, no time to fight. The bridge was a death trap. He wrenched the Pinto's head to the side, forcing the terrified animal off the trail and down the steep, muddy bank into the creek itself. Follow me! Graybell, spooked and panicked, did not want to go. Maribel, her heart hammering against her ribs, kicked her heels hard and pulled savagely on the reins, forcing the mare to follow the Pinto's lead. The horse slid down the bank, landing with a huge splash in the cold, a knee-deep water. The water slowed them, the horses struggling for footing on the slick, algae-covered rocks. Another bullet whizzed past Maribel's ear, so close she felt its heat. "This way!" Jessie shouted. He wasn't heading for the opposite bank, where the ambushers were waiting. He was turning them downstream, into the darkness. He guided the Pinto toward a nearly invisible break in the thick brush on their side of the creek. It was a game trail, barely a whisper of a path. Years ago, he yelled over the sound of the churning water and the sporadic crack of rifles. An old Paiute man showed me this, said it was the way the deer run. It comes out behind the ridge. They plunged into the thicket, branches whipping at their faces and clothes. They were in total darkness now, shielded from the moonlight and the gunmen. They could hear the men shouting in frustration behind them, but the sounds grew fainter as Jessie led them deeper into the secret trail. They rode for another mile in near silence, letting the horses pick their way through the darkness, until they finally emerged onto the open prairie, a quarter-mile from the ranch house. The house was not dark. It was a beacon of light in the night. Lanterns hung on the porch and from the corners of the barn, and it was not quiet. As they drew closer, they saw figures moving in the yard. It was Widow Alma Ridge and her sons, and old Mr. Miller from the trading post, and Gus Harrow, the printer, holding an ancient shotgun as if he knew how to use it. The community had not waited for a summons. They had come. They were forming a defensive perimeter, their wagons creating a makeshift barricade. Alma met them as they rode in. "We heard the shots," she said, her face grim. "We figured it was Rook's doing. Where are the children?" "They were in the house," Maribel cried, her heart lurching as she slid from the saddle. "Not anymore," Alma said, her voice firm. "They're safe, in the old root cellar, with my daughter-in-law." Maribel ran to the heavy wooden doors of the cellar. Inside, by the light of a single candle, she saw them. Tommy was standing guard by the steps, his face pale but his eyes fierce. Birdie was huddled in the corner, her face buried in the calico dress of Alma's daughter-in-law, her small arms wrapped tightly around her corn-husk doll. Safe. Maribel closed the doors, her relief so profound it felt like a physical blow. When she turned back to the yard, she was no longer a terrified woman. She was a general. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "I have the proof. Rook's seal. A receipt for Mercer." Gus Harrow's eyes widened. "Good God, woman! We need a judge," Maribel said. "Not a deputy. A real judge." "Ephraim Keats," Alma said immediately. "He's a hard man, but he's an honest one. He doesn't bow to Rook." Maribel went into the house. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was a block of cold, clear ice. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, her pen flying. She wrote an urgent, desperate plea to Judge Ephraim Keats, outlining the forged lien, the attempted entrapment, the arson, and the ambush. She sealed it with a drip of candle wax. She gave the letter to Alma. "Can this get to him tonight?" Alma nodded, taking the letter. "My youngest boy, Samuel. His horse is the fastest in this valley. Rook's men will never catch him." She turned and gave the letter to a tall, lean young man who disappeared into the night. The waiting was the hardest part, the armed vigil in the yard, the minutes stretching into hours. Just before dawn, a lone rider approached. It was one of Alma's neighbors, his face grim. "It's Rook," he said, breathing hard. "He's furious. He's posted a new notice on the courthouse door, a supplemental foreclosure document. Says he's seizing the property and all assets in 48 hours. It's got a big official-looking red seal on it." The final move. Rook was done with subterfuge. He was now using the law as a battering ram. Jesse, who had been cleaning his rifle with grim, methodical movements, stood up. He walked into the house, Maribel following him. He went to the stone fireplace. The children had been brought up from the cellar and were now asleep, huddled together on a mattress by the warm hearth. Slowly, deliberately, Jesse unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather creaked in the quiet room. He coiled it carefully and placed it on the rough-hewn wooden mantel. Above the sleeping children, the Colt pistol, a tool of violence and survival, gleamed dully in the lamplight. He turned to Maribel and the small group of neighbors who had followed them inside. "We win this with proof," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of an oath. "Not with blood." Maribel looked at the sleeping children, then at the gun on the mantel. She went to the table and picked up a piece of paper. It was the affidavit she had written for Tommy to sign, a simple, declarative statement of his life with Jesse. She gently shook the boy awake. He looked up, his eyes clouded with sleep and fear. "Tommy," she said softly, kneeling in front of him. "I need you to be very brave. I need you to read this for the judge. Can you do that?" She held the paper in front of him. He looked at the words, his lips moving silently. He was a boy who had only learned his letters a few weeks ago, and now he was being asked to use them to save his own life. He trembled, the paper shaking in his small hand. But then he looked up, past the paper, at Maribel's face, and then at Jesse, who stood behind her like a mountain. He saw the absolute, unwavering belief in their eyes. A new light came into his own. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else, trust. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "I can read it." Outside, as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Rook's men, seeing the ranch so heavily defended, began to disperse. A tense, fragile quiet settled over the valley. The siege was over. For now, the peace, the terrible, heavy peace before the final storm, lasted for exactly one night. The courtroom in Buckhorn Gap was not a place of grandeur. It was a single, large room that smelled of dry rot, stale tobacco, and the fine, pervasive dust that settled on everything. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, lanced through the tall, grimy windows. The benches were packed with a silent, watchful audience of ranchers, townsfolk, and a handful of Silas Rook's hired men who stood along the back wall, their presence a quiet threat. At the front, Jesse and Maribel sat at a small wooden table. Behind them sat Widow Alma, Parson Whitlock, and Gus Harrow, their face grim and determined. Tommy and Bertie were not with them. Alma had insisted they stay at her home, shielded from this ordeal. Across the aisle, Silas Rook sat with his lawyer, looking perfectly at ease, a man confident in the system he had bought and paid for. At the head of the room, on a raised dais, sat Judge Ephraim Keats. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the granite of the surrounding mountains, his face a roadmap of hard winters and harder decisions. His gaze, sharp and assessing, missed nothing. Deputy Vance Mercer stood beside the judge's bench, acting as bailiff. He held Jesse's hastily filed application in his hand, a smirk playing on his lips. "Your Honor," Mercer began, his voice oozing a false deference, "we have before us a simple matter of territorial welfare. Mr. Calder," he gestured dismissively, "has failed to comply with county filing procedures, has no legal claim to the wards, and his property has been deemed hazardous. I move to dismiss his baseless application and proceed with the court-ordered placement of the children." Judge Keats did not look at Mercer. He looked at Jesse. "Mr. Calder." Before Jesse could speak, Maribel rose. Her dress was simple. Her hair was tied back severely, but she stood with the unshakable posture of a woman who possessed a truth more powerful than any law book in this room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "we are prepared to present evidence to the contrary on all points." "Evidence," Mercer scoffed. "A few signatures from her neighbors." "This is my courtroom, Deputy," Judge Keats said, his voice a low rumble that silenced the room. "Not your office. I will hear the evidence." He turned his granite gaze to Maribel. "Proceed, Miss Quinn." Maribel walked to the judge's bench, placing the fraudulent lien document before him. "Your Honor, this is the lien Mr. Rook claims to hold on the Coyotes Mercy Ranch. It is dated April 12th, 1877. I submit to the court that this document is a forgery." Rook's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! The witness is offering an unsubstantiated, slanderous opinion." "It is not an opinion, Your Honor," Maribel said calmly. "It is a conclusion based on 3 observable facts. First, the paper itself." She produced a small magnifying glass from her reticule. "If you will examine the fibers, you will see they are short, uniform, and opaque. This is wood pulp paper, a manufacturing process that did not become common in this territory until after 1882. A legal document from 1877 would have been executed on rag paper, which has longer, more translucent cotton fibers." A murmur went through the courtroom. Gus Harrow, the printer, nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "Second," Maribel continued, her confidence growing, "the ink. It is a deep, consistent black. It is a modern carbon ink. The standard for legal documents in 1877 was iron gall ink, which, over 6 years, would have oxidized and faded to a distinct brownish color. The ink on this page has not aged a day." Judge Keats leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued, examining the document under his own sharp gaze. "And third, Your Honor," Maribel said, delivering the final, technical blow. "The county seal. While it is an excellent copy, a precise measurement will show that the entire impression is tilted 7 degrees to the left of the vertical axis. The official county press of that era had a known flaw, a slight shift in the mechanism that produced a tilt of no more than 4 degrees. This seal was made with a different, counterfeit press." She stepped back from the bench. "This document was not created in 1877. It was created recently, for the sole purpose of defrauding this court and Mr. Calder." "This is an outrage," Rook's lawyer sputtered. "She has no proof." "On the contrary," Judge Keats rumbled, "she has presented a hypothesis. Now let us see if it can be proven." He looked out at the room. I was informed by a late-night messenger that a Mr. Gus Harrow might have something to contribute. Gus Harrow, clutching a large, flat portfolio, walked nervously to the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Miss Quinn came to me with her concerns. As a printer, I recognized the anomalies she described. To preserve the evidence, I made a lithographic press proof of the key elements." He opened the portfolio, revealing a pristine sheet of paper with two images printed side by side. One was a perfect, detailed copy of the signature and seal from the lien. The other was a copy of the same signature and seal from a document in the church archives. "The differences are minute," Gus said, pointing. "But to a printer's eye, they are a chasm. The pressure points, the ink spread, they are from two different hands and two different presses." "And who is the signature supposed to be?" Keats asked. "Elijah Abernathy, the county clerk in 77 inches, Parson Whitlock said, stepping forward. "A man I knew well. I brought the church ledger, Your Honor. Elijah was a witness at every baptism." He laid the heavy book on the bench, open to a page of spidery, faded script. He pointed. "Look at the man's T, Your Honor." He crossed it high with a flourish, and his F. It was a grand, open loop. "The signature on that lien," he said, his voice ringing with moral authority, "is an insult to his memory." Judge Keats stared at the two signatures, then at Silas Rook, whose smug composure was beginning to crack. "The character of a document is in question." Keats said, "Let us now hear about the character of the man. Widow Ridge." Alma Ridge walked to the bench, not with the nervousness of Gus or the solemnity of the parson, but with the righteous fury of a matriarch defending her own. She held the petition, now filled with dozens of names. "This is more than signatures, Your Honor," she said, her voice strong. "This is the testimony of this entire valley. I have known Jesse Calder since he first came here, and I have seen him raise these children for 2 winters. I have the ledger from Miller's trading post, where he traded a good saddle blanket for a case of canned milk when Bertie was sick. I have a receipt for fever medicine he bought for Tommy. I have a list of the books he bought from the traveling peddler so Miss Quinn could teach them." She looked directly at the judge. "Men like Silas Rook and Vance Mercer see children as wards, as problems, as leverage. Jesse Calder sees them as family. You want to know if his home is suitable. His home is the only true home these children have ever known." A wave of assent rippled through the ranchers and townspeople on the benches. "And what does the child himself have to say?" Keats asked, his gaze softening as he looked toward the back of the courtroom, where a deputy had just brought Tommy in through a side door. Tommy walked the long aisle alone, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent room. He was small, his face pale, but he walked with a straight back. He clutched the affidavit in his hand. He stood before the judge's bench, a small boy facing a mountain of a man. "Son," Judge Keats said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "do you have something for this court?" Tommy swallowed hard. He looked at Maribel, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. He took a deep breath. "My name is Thomas Pike," he began, his voice trembling but clear. "I live at the Coyotes Mercy Ranch. Mr. Jesse Calder took me in after the fire." He paused, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. He faltered, the sea of adult faces overwhelming him. Jesse stood up. He did not speak. He simply stood, a silent, solid pillar of support. Tommy saw him. He took another breath, and when he spoke again, the tremble was gone, replaced by a fierce, childish conviction. He let the paper drop from his hand. He didn't need it. He was speaking from a place deeper than memory. He's not the father of my blood," Tommy said, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "But he is the father of my heart." A collective breath was drawn by the people on the benches. Alma Ridge was openly weeping. Jesse's stoic facade finally broke, his eyes glistening. Judge Keats was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the boy. "Thank you, son," he said softly. "You may sit," as Tommy walked back to a waiting Maribel, who enveloped him in a fierce hug. Silas Rook leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer. He still believed his power was absolute. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, rising smoothly. "While this is all very touching, it changes nothing. Mr. Calder failed to pay the $50 administrative fee. His application is invalid. The foreclosure stands. The law is the law." "Indeed it is," Maribel said, rising one last time. She walked to the bench, holding the final piece of evidence, the torn half of the receipt. "Your Honor, when Mr. Calder attempted to file his application, Deputy Mercer demanded a $50 cash fee, a fee that exists on no official county ledger. When I was recovering some items belonging to Mr. Rook's associates, I happened upon this." She placed the scrap of paper on the bench. "It is a receipt for $25, half of the bribe, and it bears half of Deputy Mercer's signature." Mercer, who had been standing frozen with fury, turned white as a sheet. "That's a lie. It proves nothing." "Perhaps not," Judge Keats said, his eyes like chips of ice. "But I find myself curious." He turned to the other bailiff. "Go to the county treasurer's office. Tell Mr. Abernathy's nephew that I request he bring me his cash box, specifically the pouch containing discretionary fees." The bailiff scurried out. The 5 minutes he was gone were the loudest silence Maribel had ever heard. He returned with a small, stout man who was clutching a locked metal box. "Open it," the judge commanded. The treasurer, sweating profusely, unlocked the box. Inside were coins and bills, and a small leather pouch. Judge Keats reached in and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt, torn in half. He unfolded it and laid it on the bench next to the piece Maribel had provided. They matched perfectly. The tear was clean, the handwriting was identical, and the serial number, printed along the bottom, was now complete. The trap had closed. Judge Ephraim Keats stood up, his full height seeming to fill the entire room. He picked up his gavel. "This hearing is concluded," he boomed. "Deputy Mercer, you are suspended, pending a full investigation into bribery and conspiracy to defraud this court. Your badge, now." Mercer, his face slack with shock, fumbled to unpin the star from his vest. Mr. Rook," Keats continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "You will be fined the maximum allowable sum for filing a fraudulent document and attempting to pervert the course of justice. A criminal investigation will follow." Rook shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This isn't over. Keats, you have no idea who you're dealing with." "Bailiff," Keats said calmly, "escort Mr. Rook to an office where he can give a full statement regarding the creation of this lien." The bailiff, looking pleased, took Rook firmly by the arm. Rook shot Jesse a look of pure venom. "I'll see you in the ground. Calder, outside of this courtroom." "And finally," Keats said, his voice softening as he looked at Jesse and Maribel, "the court finds that the immediate welfare of the children is best served by remaining in the care of Mr. Calder. This court will pave the way for his guardianship application to be accepted, processed, and approved without any further administrative fees." Gavel down. The final, sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room. It was over. As the crowd erupted into cheers and flooded the aisle to congratulate them, Jesse stood still. He didn't speak. He simply turned to Maribel, and in front of the entire town, he placed his large hand on her shoulder and squeezed, just once. It was a gesture of gratitude so profound, so full of everything he could not say, that it brought tears to her eyes. A small hand slipped into hers. She looked down. It was Bertie, who had been brought in at the last moment by Alma. The little girl looked up at her, her eyes wide and shining with a complete, uncomplicated trust. And then, for the first time, in a voice as clear and fragile as a tiny bell, she whispered a single word. "Mama." Outside, on the high roof of the courthouse, a flock of crows that had been roosting on the steeple suddenly took flight. They burst into the sky, a flurry of black wings against the clean, blue canvas, cawing as if to announce that the long, dark storm had finally broken. The wind had changed. The victory in the courtroom was a clean, sharp line drawn in the sand. But the frontier did not respect the rulings of men. The law could grant them peace from Silas Rook, but it could not grant them an easy winter. And winter came early that year, not with a gentle dusting of frost, but with a roar. It descended from the northern mountains like a wolf pack, a howling, hungry beast of a season that chased the last of the autumn warmth from the valley and buried the world in a sudden, shocking blanket of white. The snow began in the dead of night, thick, wet flakes that clung to every surface. By morning, the roof of the barn was a heavy white sheet, the fence lines had vanished, and the wind, a raw and relentless force, shrieked through the bare, red branches of the willows along the frozen creek. The world had shrunk, its vastness erased, its colors reduced to the stark, unforgiving palette of white and gray. The Coyotes' Mercy Ranch became an island in a sea of snow. Their victory had left them safe, but it had also left them poor. The legal fight, the days lost to travel and testimony, had put them behind in their winter preparations. The granary, those saved from Rook's men, was not as full as it should have been. Jesse, studying the dwindling sacks of grain with a grim expression, knew they would not last until the spring thaw. "There's a trader over in Sparrow Wash," he announced one morning, his breath pluming in the frigid kitchen air. "Jonas Green. He's got a surplus of cornmeal. I can trade him the last of the summer hides for it." "In this?" Maribel asked, looking out the window at the snow, which was falling so thickly it was like a curtain. "Jesse, you can't see 10 feet. "The storm's supposed to let up by midday," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And the grain won't wait. We need it." He looked at Tommy, who was watching him with wide, serious eyes. "Tommy, you're with me. Time you learn to manage the team in a blow." Tommy's chest puffed out. It was not a chore. It was a promotion. He was no longer just a boy to be protected. He was a partner in the ranch's survival. Maribel's heart felt a familiar pang, a mixture of pride and a deep, maternal fear. They set out an hour later, the big work wagon pulled by their 2 strongest draft horses. Jesse handled the reins, his face set against the wind, while Tommy sat beside him, a small, bundled figure learning the hard lessons of the land. Maribel and Bertie stood on the porch, waving until the wagon was swallowed by the swirling snow. The storm did not let up. It worsened. The wind rose to a keening shriek, and the snow turned to a fine, blinding powder that stung the eyes and cut to the bone. Maribel spent the day in a state of quiet, humming tension. She kept the fire roaring, a pot of thick stew simmering on the stove, her ears tuned to the sound of the wind, listening for the rumble of wagon wheels that did not come. By late afternoon, as a premature dusk began to settle, a cold, hard knot of dread was tightening in her stomach. They should have been back hours ago. Sparrow Wash was only a few miles away, a straight shot across the frozen flatlands. She bundled Bertie in a heavy wool coat and took her out to the barn. The wind tore at them, a physical force that stole their breath, while Bertie held the lantern, her small face a mask of worry. Maribel climbed the ladder to the hayloft. From its high window, she could see nothing, just the endless roiling chaos of the storm. They were out there, somewhere in that white wilderness, and they were in trouble. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She could not ride out. She would be lost in minutes. She was helpless, but the memory of the fire, of her own surprising strength, rose to meet the fear. "Be smart," she had told Tommy. "Be afraid in the right way." She thought of the stories old man Miller told at the trading post, stories of lost travelers and signal fires. She had no flair, but she had something better. "Birdie, stay here," she commanded, her voice sharp with purpose. She scrambled down the ladder and ran, buffeted by the wind, to the wood pile. She grabbed the can of kerosene they used for the lanterns. She took an old, tattered horse blanket from a peg. She fought her way to the highest point of the ranch yard, a small, wind-swept knoll near the main gate. There, she built a pyre. She stacked the wood high, doused it with the precious kerosene, and stuffed the blanket underneath. With numb, fumbling fingers, she struck a match. The wind tore it out. She struck another, cupping it with her body. The flame caught. The pyre erupted in a tower of orange flame, a defiant, desperate beacon against the white fury of the storm. It was a signal, a prayer, a point of light in the darkness. "Here, we are here. Come home." Jesse saw it. He and Tommy had made the trade, their wagon now heavy with sacks of life-saving grain. But on the way back, they had run into a nightmare. The landscape, so familiar, had become an alien terrain, its landmarks erased by the snow. Jesse, navigating by instinct, had made a slight miscalculation. Instead of hitting the solid, well-frozen ford of Sparrow Wash, he had guided the team onto a stretch of newer, thinner ice downstream. The first crack was a sickening sound, like a bone breaking. The led horse screamed, its front legs plunging through the ice into the black, frigid water below. The wagon lurched violently, its heavy front wheels breaking through as well, the entire rig tilting at a precarious angle. They were trapped. The terrified struggles of the horse only served to break the ice further, the current pulling at it, threatening to drag the whole wagon, the other horse and its two occupants into the freezing creek. "Whoa, hold still!" Jesse roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. He knew, with a terrible, sinking certainty, that they were moments from disaster. He could cut the horses free, but they would lose the grain, their winter's supply. And in the struggle, he and Tommy could easily be pulled in. It was then, through the blinding curtain of snow, that he saw it. A faint, flickering orange glow to the southeast. A signal. Maribel. The sight of it, the knowledge that she was there, thinking, fighting for them, sent a surge of new strength through him. He was not alone in this. Maribel did not just wait by her fire. She knew a signal was not enough. They were stuck, and she knew where. Sparrow Wash. It was the only real danger between the ranch and the trader. She worked with a frantic, focused energy. She ran to the barn, her mind a whirlwind of practical geometry. She gathered every rope, every lariat, every scrap of leather strapping she could find. She tied them together, her fingers stiff with cold, her knots sure and strong from a childhood spent on the New England coast. She was building a lifeline. She led the remaining horses from the barn, the Pinto, Graybell, and two other sturdy mares. She tied them together, nose to tail, creating a living chain, a team of 4. She tied one end of her long, improvised rope to the Pinto's saddle horn. She led her team out into the storm, toward the creek, her signal fire a guiding point behind her. She did not go to the main ford. She went upstream, where the creek was narrower and the banks were steeper, where she knew the ice would be thickest. When she reached the spot Jesse and Tommy were trapped, the sight almost broke her nerve. The wagon was tilted at a horrifying angle, the lead horse screaming in terror, its struggles growing weaker. Jesse was out on the ice, clinging to the harness, trying to calm the animal, while Tommy sat frozen in the wagon seat, his face a small, white blur of fear. "Jesse!" she screamed, her voice torn away by the wind. He saw her. His face, for a single, unguarded moment, registered a look of pure, unadulterated shock, and then profound relief. The rope, she yelled, pointing to the line she was uncoiling. Tie it to the wagon tongue. He understood immediately. While Maribel positioned her team of horses on the solid ground of the bank, Jessie, moving with a perilous, desperate speed, untangled the struggling lead horse from its harness. Then he waded through the freezing water, breaking the ice with his body, and secured the end of her lifeline to the front of the heavy wagon.
Now, Tommy, Maribel screamed. Get down, get clear.
The boy jolted into action, scrambled out of the back of the wagon onto the more solid ice. Pull, Maribel yelled to her team of horses, her voice a raw command. Pull. She cracked a length of rope over the Pinto's back. The intelligent horse dug in its hooves, throwing its weight into the line. Behind it, Graybell and the other two mares did the same. The rope went taut, groaning with the strain. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The wagon was an anchor, held fast by the ice and the mud of the creek bed. Then, with a great, groaning screech of tortured wood and shattering ice, it moved. An inch, then a foot. The four horses on the bank, working as a single powerful unit, dug in, their muscles straining, their breath clouding in the frigid air. Slowly, painfully, they dragged the crippled wagon, laden with its precious cargo, from the creek's icy grip and onto the safety of the bank. They were safe. The grain was safe. Her family was safe. The kitchen was an oasis of warmth and steam. Wet coats, hats, and gloves dripped from every peg and chair back, filling the air with the smell of damp wool and cold leather. A fresh pot of coffee was boiling on the stove, its rich aroma a welcome antidote to the chill. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside, they were cocooned in a world of flickering lantern light and the comforting crackle of the fire. Tommy and Bertie, wrapped in dry blankets, were asleep, huddled together on the mattress by the hearth, their faces flushed with warmth and exhaustion. Maribel was standing at the stove, stirring the stew, her back to the room. Jesse sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. He had not said a word since they had returned, since he had stumbled into the house, half frozen and utterly spent. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with everything that had happened, with everything that had almost been lost. He watched her. He watched the set of her shoulders, the efficient way she moved, the quiet competence that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from the stove. She had not panicked. She had not wept. She had seen the problem, and she had solved it. She had tied the ropes. She had saved them. Maribel, he said. His voice was low, rough with emotion. She stopped stirring but did not turn.
Yes, Jessie.
He put his mug down. He looked at the sleeping children, then back at her. The words he had never known how to say, the feelings he had buried for a lifetime, finally rose to the surface, clear and undeniable. When you first came here, he began, his voice hesitant, I needed a teacher. For them. He gestured with his chin toward the children. Someone to give them letters, numbers, a chance I never had. He took a slow, steadying breath. I don't need a teacher anymore. Maribel. She finally turned, the wooden spoon still in her hand. Her face was guarded, her eyes questioning. I need you, he said, the words coming out in a rush of pure, unvarnished truth. He stood up, closing the distance between them. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. I need you to help me raise them, to finish what we've started, not as their teacher. He reached out and took her hand, the one not holding the spoon. His hand was large, calloused, and still cold from the storm, but his grip was warm and firm. I need you to be their mother, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I need you to be my wife. The spoon fell from Maribel's hand, clattering unheard onto the wooden floor. The breath left her body, her carefully constructed world, her identity as the lonely, wandering teacher, shattered into a million pieces. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were not tears of pity, or sorrow, or even relief. They were tears of profound, staggering joy. She was not being offered a position out of gratitude or necessity. She was not being taken in as a charity case. She was being chosen. She, Maribel Quinn, the barren woman, the woman who had believed her heart was a closed and empty room, was being asked to be the center of this family, the heart of this home. She could not speak. The words were trapped in her throat. She raised her free hand, trembling, and placed it on his rough, wind-chafed cheek. She looked into his eyes, and she saw her future. She saw a lifetime of shared burdens, of quiet companionship, of children's laughter, and of a love as steady and enduring as the land itself. She nodded. Just a single, slow, deliberate nod. A simple movement that answered the question, accepted the offer, and sealed her fate. As if she had been waiting for a signal. The kitchen door burst open, admitting a swirl of snow and a bundled, determined figure. It was Widow Alma Ridge. "I saw your fire," she announced, brushing the snow from her shawl. "And I saw you bring the wagon in. I figured you'd be needing this." She held out her hand. In her palm lay two simple, unadorned rings. They were not gold or silver. They were fashioned from brass, glowing with a soft, warm light, still bearing the faint marks of the blacksmith's hammer. "Had old Jedediah at the smithy bend these for you last week," she said, with a knowing look. "Figured it was only a matter of time." She took Maribel's hand and slid one of the rings onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. She gave the other to Jessie, who, with a look of stunned gratitude, took Maribel's hand in his and slid the second ring into place beside the first. Birdie, awakened by the commotion, sat up on the mattress. She had been weaving a small wreath from the dried grasses Maribel kept in a vase by the window. She stood up, her face glowing with a sleepy, innocent joy, and walked over to Maribel. She reached up on her tiptoes and placed the fragile, lovely crown of grass on Maribel's head. Then she giggled, a sound as bright and clear as a chiming bell. Alma took a small, worn book from her pocket. "Parson snowed in," she said, "but he told me the words. They're not fancy, but they're strong." And there, in the steamy, lantern-lit kitchen, while the wind howled outside and the stove crackled its warm applause, Alma Ridge spoke the simple, binding words. They were not in a church. There was no music, no crowd, but it was the most sacred ceremony Maribel could have ever imagined. A family, not of blood, but of choice. When it was done, Jesse turned to her. He framed her face in his large, gentle hands and kissed her. It was not the tentative, questioning kiss of the pasture. It was a kiss of certainty, of homecoming, of a promise made and a future begun. It was a warm, deep kiss in the middle of a snowstorm, and it held enough heat to last a lifetime. The windows were fogged with steam, blurring the raging storm outside. A lantern, hung on the porch, swung wildly in the wind, its light a dancing, joyful beacon. The moon was lost behind the clouds, but it didn't matter. The light from the kitchen, the light of their new, unshakable family, was more than bright enough to see them through the winter, which had arrived with the fury of a sudden war, retreated with the slow, grudging withdrawal of a defeated army. The thaw came in drips and trickles, then in gushing, muddy torrents as the snow surrendered its grip on the valley. The creek, which had been a ribbon of black ice, now swelled its banks, and the air, for the first time in months, lost its sharp, cutting edge and carried the deep, rich scent of damp earth and the promise of new life. Spring unfurled across the Coyotes' Mercy Ranch, not just in the tender green shoots that pushed through the mud, but in the rhythm of their lives. The fear that had been their constant companion, a cold shadow at their backs, was gone, replaced by the simple, grounding certainties of hard work and shared purpose. The official news arrived with the first mail rider of the season, a grizzled old man whose horse was as caked in mud as he was. He handed Jessie a thick, formal envelope, its back sealed with the imposing wax crest of Judge Ephraim Keats. They opened it together at the kitchen table, the four of them, a silent and anxious audience. Maribel read the words aloud, her voice clear and steady. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the meaning was as clear as the spring sky. The court hereby grants the petition of Jessie Calder for full guardianship of the minor, Thomas Pike. Furthermore, the court appoints Maribel Calder, née Quinn, as co-guardian of education and welfare. Maribel's voice caught on her new name. Legally bound to this man, this land, this family. She looked at Jessie, and the slow, rare smile that spread across his face was brighter than the morning sun. The letter went on. Judge Keats, true to his word, had been thorough. A full territorial investigation had been launched into the affairs of Silas Rook. His fraudulent land claims, stretching back years, had created a house of cards that was now collapsing under the weight of legal scrutiny. Vance Mercer had been formally dismissed from his post, his badge and his authority stripped from him. Justice, Maribel thought, often has slow, quiet footsteps, but when it arrives, its tread is heavy and sure. With the legal battle won and the season turning, the Coyotes' Mercy Ranch began to transform. It was no longer just a home. It was becoming the heart of the valley. Maribel reestablished her school, not in the confines of the kitchen, but in its rightful place, under the great trembling aspen tree by the creek. Its leaves were a fresh, vibrant green, and the dappled sunlight that fell through them was warm and welcoming. Her first students, Tommy and Bertie, were now her most senior pupils. They were soon joined by others. The children from the Salt Kettle homestead, a pair of shy, tow-headed brothers, began to arrive every morning, their father having traded a promise of 2 cured hams for their schooling. 2 sisters from the Elk Ribbon Ranch, whose family had signed the petition, came next. Their tuition was paid weekly in a basket of fresh eggs and 2 bars of harsh lye soap. Maribel accepted it all with a gracious heart. She was not just teaching letters. She was weaving a community, stitch by stitch. The ranch itself seemed to breathe a new, more generous air. It became a sanctuary for the lost and the stray. A 3-legged dog, which had been abandoned by a passing freight wagon, limped into the yard one day and was met not with a boot, but with a bowl of scraps and a gentle scratch behind the ears. He never left. A wild goat with a broken horn wandered down from the high country and took up residence in the barn, stubbornly refusing to leave and eventually contributing its milk to their larder. Jessie, too, was changed. The solitude that had wrapped around him like a shroud was gone, burned away by the fire, washed away by the flood, and healed by the steady warmth of a family's love. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He spent his days not just tending his own herd, but helping his neighbors. His skill with leather and wood, a valuable commodity. He would repair a broken saddle for one man, accepting payment in a sack of heirloom seeds. He would help another raise a new barn wall, and be repaid with a side of cured bacon. The ranch was no longer an island. It was a port, a place of trade and mutual support. The true measure of the change, the true evidence of their healing, came on a warm afternoon in early summer. The whole family was gathered on the porch. Jessie was mending a bridle, his hands moving with their familiar, competent grace. Bertie sat on the steps, carefully braiding the hair of her corn-husked doll, to which Jessie had painstakingly added a full head of yarn hair. Maribel was looking over Tommy's latest schoolwork. His handwriting, once a defiant scrawl, was now neat and clear. He had been working for days on his first real composition, a short essay on a topic of his own choosing. "Tommy," Maribel said gently, "this is very good. Would you be willing to share it with us?" The boy looked up, a flush of pride and nervousness on his face. He glanced at Jesse, who stopped his work and gave him a small, encouraging nod. Tommy took the slate from Maribel's hands. He stood up, cleared his throat, but his own words seemed too large for his mouth.
"Birdie,"
he whispered, holding the slate out to his sister.
"You read it."
Birdie, who could now read with a slow but steady confidence, took the slate. She stood beside her brother, a small, serious figure, and in her clear, high voice, she began to read the words he had written.
"My essay,"
she announced formally. "It is called Home." She took a breath. Home is not a roof. The barn has a roof, but the goat is the only one who thinks it is home. Home is not a plate of food. We ate food before, but it was not home. Home is a fire in the winter. It is the sound of the pump in the morning. It is the teacher's voice. It is the strong hands that pull you from the ice. She paused, her small finger tracing the last, simple line of chalk. She looked up at Jesse, then at Maribel. Home is who stays. She read. The words, so simple, so profound, hung in the warm summer air. Maribel felt the familiar sting of tears, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a deep, overflowing gratitude. She looked at Jesse and saw that his eyes were glistening, too. He reached out and put his hand on Tommy's shoulder, a gesture of pride so immense it needed no words. The whole porch, their whole world, erupted in a round of heartfelt, familial applause. That night, the moon was full and bright, a silver dollar in a sky of deep, endless velvet. The air was warm and smelled of clover and the distant, sweet scent of the pines. The chorus of the frogs by the creek was a gentle, rhythmic lullaby. Jesse took Maribel by the hand. He didn't speak. He simply led her from the porch, past the sleeping barn, to the same grassy patch where he had first kissed her. He had brought a heavy wool blanket, and he spread it on the soft grass. He stood before her, and a slow smile touched his lips. He held out his hand. "May I, Mrs. Calder?" he asked, a gentle teasing in his voice. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her close. They began to dance, slowly, a simple, swaying two-step on the moonlit grass. There was no music but the sound of the frogs and the whisper of the night wind. It was a dance of quiet celebration, of a journey ended and a new one begun. They moved as one, their bodies knowing a rhythm that their hearts had already learned. When the dance was over, they did not move apart. He held her, his arms wrapped securely around her, his chin resting on her head. Maribel sighed, a sound of pure contentment, and rested her forehead against the solid, steady wall of his chest. She could feel the slow, strong beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm that was now the rhythm of her own life. His arms tightened around her, a gesture of pure, protective affection. She tilted her head back, and he bent to kiss her. It was a long, slow kiss, full of the warmth of the summer night and the deep, quiet love that had grown between them. It was a kiss that held no questions, only answers. His breath was warm on her skin, and his hands, so large and calloused, were infinitely gentle as they stroked her back. The world, with all its sharp edges and past pains, seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them, anchored to this spot, to this moment. They stood like that for a long time, held in a warm, tender embrace, their breathing synchronized, sharing small, soft kisses that were promises of 1,000 more to come. The vast, star-dusted sky seemed to lean in closer, a silent, benevolent witness. Finally, they eased apart, just enough to see each other's faces in the silvery light. He touched his nose to hers, a gesture of playful, profound intimacy. "Tomorrow," he whispered, his voice a low, happy rumble. "We'll do this again." She smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Yes," she whispered back, "we will." It was the simplest of promises, and it held a universe of warmth, enough to last them through all the winters to come. On the frontier, family was never a thing of blood. It was a harder, truer thing than that. It was a thing of choice, of grit, of shared survival. It was forged in fire and tempered in floods. Family was the people who saddled their own horses and rode into the storm for you when the sky was at its darkest. It was the ones who stayed. She bit her lip when the lonely rancher unbuckled her skirt in the moonlight. A single, private moment of overwhelming emotion. Not of fear, but of the staggering, heart-stopping realization that she and he and the children they both loved were finally, truly, and irrevocably home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey to the Red Willow Basin, be sure to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us by pressing the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.